Hello and welcome. My name is Jennifer Gates, Field Services Director for the California Preservation Foundation. Thank you for joining this webinar entitled Section 106, Webinar Series, Module 3, Consultation Process, Memorandum of Agreements and Programmatic Agreements. The format for today's webinar will include a presentation followed by time for questions and answers. There is a toolbar on the right side of your screen. If you have a question at any time during the presentation, please type it in the box and I will hold the question until the end for the panelists to answer. You will be muted throughout the presentation. To hide or unhide this toolbar, click on the orange arrow. Today's presentation will be by Jane Lehman and Julie Polanco. Jane is the Regional Historic Preservation Officer for the General Services Administration's Pacific Rim region. Jane is a licensed architect with a specialty in historic preservation and has over 20 years of experience in federal historic preservation work. In addition to GSA, she has worked for the National Park Service and the Federal Emergency Management Agency and has negotiated dozens of agreement documents. Ms. Polanco is currently the architectural historian and former chair of the California State Historical Resources Commission. She is also the director of cultural resources for Lend-Lease, stewards of more than 1,500 National Register listed buildings and 3 National Historic Landmark Districts throughout the United States. Prior to joining Lend-Lease, she was a senior project manager for the Presidio Trust in San Francisco. Julianne has directed numerous planning and preservation projects, including those utilizing historic tax credits. Ms. Polanco received degrees from the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation at Columbia University and UC Santa Barbara. Before entering the historic preservation field, she held numerous environmental policy appointments for the state of California. Thank you for joining us today, Jane and Julie.
Thank you, Jennifer. Well, welcome. Good afternoon, and thanks for joining for this segment entitled Memorandums of Agreement and Programmatic Agreements. I just want to recap a little bit about what we've gone over in the first 2 modules. The first one was an overview of Section 106, defined your undertaking, talked about the effects that you were having to historic properties. And then in the second one, you realized that you were having an adverse effect, you would have entered into consultation, and then we discussed mitigation measures. Once you've gotten to that point, it's time to start thinking about preparing a memorandum of agreement. Memorandums of agreement, sorry, I got to get used to this. So once you've gotten done with the mitigation measures, it's time to start preparing a memorandum of agreement. The purpose of the consultation is to look for ways to avoid, minimize, or mitigate adverse effects. Once you've done that, you enter into agreement to make sure that those measures are carried out. And I just, as a side note, want to say that if an agreement isn't reached, you need to get council comments. But that's a rare occasion. Generally, if you keep working through consultation, an agreement is reached. So what do Section 106 agreements do? Well, they're the formal official record of agreements made during consultation. They're going to record the outcome of the consultation in addition to the terms and conditions that are agreed upon by the consulting party. They're going to govern the implementation of your undertaking for your program and all of its parts. And they're going to identify responsible parties for carrying out the terms and conditions. And I just want to say as well that they are legally binding and enforceable in court. A lot of times historic preservation doesn't get the respect that it really needs and deserves, but these are legally binding documents. So when you're preparing them, you need to keep that in mind. So who participates in an MOA? It's basically the same parties that were in your consultation, because this is the formal record of your consultation. There's the federal agency, the State Historic Preservation Officer, that's SHPO for short, the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, that's ACHP or Council they're referred to. Those are the 3 main parties in a memorandum of agreement. And in the beginning consultation, if you recall, you were required to, if you had determined you had an adverse effect to a historic property, to notify the Advisory Council. And they were going to then determine whether or not their involvement was necessary. If they haven't participated in your consultation, if they've sent you a document that said, thanks, but we're not going to participate, then you're going to go ahead with the federal agency and the SHPO, and that's referred to as a two-party MOA. A three-party MOA is if the council has participated in your consultation and they're going to sign your MOA. But there's other signing parties as well. These are referred to as invited signatories, and you definitely want any party that has a responsibility under the MOA to sign it. But these can be a wide range of entities. It could be, as listed here, Indian tribes, Native Hawaiian organizations, applicants for federal funding or permits, local governments. I've done MOAs where I've had nonprofit health clinics or educational organizations sign that were receiving excess federal property. I've signed with local government agencies that were receiving disaster assistance funding. And then in that case, we also signed with the state agency that the funding was passing through, with Indian tribes, Native South Pacific Island groups. You may also have a developer that's building something for the federal government. If that's the case, you'd want them to sign. Julie's going to talk a little bit about private entities in her case study. So there's invited signatories, but there are also concurring parties. And these parties may not have an actual role in the MOA, but they're agreeing to the terms of the MOA, and they have participated in consultation. In a lot of cases, it's historical societies or historic preservation organizations like CPF. The National Trust is involved in a lot of MOAs as well. It could also be individuals that have an interest in the undertaking. They would have to have an interest in the historic preservation of the undertaking, but it could be, related individuals. You can also, for concurring parties, have other federal agencies, Indian tribes, state or local governments, basically any that could be invited signatories can also be concurring parties as well, depending on what role they're playing in the MOA. So the difference between invited versus concurring parties is that invited signatories have full rights to amend or terminate the MOA, where the concurring parties do not. But it's also important to remember that neither invited or concurring parties have the ability to invalidate it if they don't sign. It's still going to go back to the two or the three parties that I talked about in the beginning, the federal agency, the SHPO, or the advisory council. So a little bit about what successful agreement documents have. It's important to get the support of your agency leadership in the beginning. You really want them involved through the process because, as I mentioned before, these are legally binding enforceable documents. So they're going to be signed by somebody that's fairly high up in your organization. It could be a director of an agency. It could be maybe a regional director, federal preservation officer. Whoever it is, it's going to be a fairly high up person who's going to want to have his legal staff review it before he actually signs it to see what he's signing. So you don't want to get all done, negotiated all the wording, and then send it to the director and have them ask a lot of questions about it or not understand it or not agree with it, even worse. So draft the agreement as the consultation is proceeding. Keep it simple and straightforward, and make sure that a cold reader can understand it, that it's not so loaded with legalese that it's not readily understandable to somebody who's not, may not work in historic preservation on a daily basis. So what are these agreement documents going to contain? Well, they're going to contain all the stipulations that are relating to how a federal agency is going to carry out its Section 106 responsibilities. So I'll go over them in greater detail later, but it's going to relate to Section 106 responsibilities. So what should not go in there? Well, other regulations, requirements shouldn't go in there. So NEPA responsibilities, NAGPRA, those things to comply with those laws don't belong in Section 106 agreement documents. You also don't want private or side agreements between consulting parties. You want to make sure that everything that's in yours really pertains to historic preservation and Section 106. And you also can't, and you keep in mind that although you can outline alternative ways to meet regulations within the programmatic or the memorandum of agreement, you can't take away rights that are given to a consulting party under the Section 106 regulations. They still get those anyway. So that's just an overview. Now, there's 4 standard parts to a Section 106 agreement: the title, the preamble, which are also referred to as the whereas clauses, stipulations, and the execution clause, which has the signatures. So a lot of MOAs may also have an appendix or appendices attached to them, but that's not required. These 4 are going to appear in all of your agreement documents that you do. So, title. What is a title? It's not a 1 or 2 word federal building or dam or anything that you've informally called this project, Main Street. It's very specific. It's always going to have the type of agreement, memorandum of agreement. The only other word that's going to appear there is possibly programmatic agreement. You're going to list the signatories, and those generally will be the 2 or 3 party signatories, that the federal agency, the SHPO, and the advisory council. Although you can also put some other parties into your title if it works for you. Do whatever works. And then you're going to have the project name and location. And if you look at the colored boxes, I've taken actual examples of agreement documents that I've done or been a part of, and I've put them in there so that you can use them. MOAs are not creative writing assignments. They're very standardized wording. So anything that works, go ahead and use in your memorandums of agreement. So in terms of the project name, if you look at the blue box, for the disposal and reuse of a 450-acre site in South Finnegan, Guam, GSA control number, blah, blah, blah. It's a very, very specific thing. I mean, you know right in the title which project that it's referring to. Again, regarding the reconfiguration of the land port of entry, San Ysidro, it's a fairly meaty title. So once you've got the title, then you go into the preamble. And the preamble is, like I said, what we refer to as the whereas clauses. And it gets that name because every single paragraph starts with whereas. And the whereas clauses can be anywhere from, half a page maybe to 2 pages long. I mean, it's going to outline all of the givens of your project. The order is not specified, but there's some required components to the whereas clauses. One is you have to make sure that you have the full detail of your project described in there, and how the federal agency plans to carry it out, whether they're going to fund it, issue a permit, a license, what they're going to do. So here's a couple of examples. Whereas GSA will carry out a comprehensive modernization of the U.S. General Services Administration National Office Building located at 1800 F Street, Washington, D.C. That comprehensive modernization of the GSA office building is the project. And then this is another whereas clause that was put in for a different project that said, whereas we've received funding under the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, and if this funding is not obligated by a certain date, it's going to expire, because that was a very important part to that MOA. We needed to make sure that everybody was aware that it was time sensitive. So the other thing I want to say is that this is where you define your acronyms or first mention them. So in the very first whereas clause, United States General Services Administration, and then parentheses GSA. Okay, so from then on, you can use GSA throughout your document for the federal agency. The other important abbreviation is undertaking. And you could use undertaking or project, but it's important to be consistent throughout when you're saying it. So they said that the comprehensive modernization of 1800F is the undertaking. So you look down and you see where undertaking with a capital U, that's going to refer back to that particular project. So you can start listing most of your acronyms and a few abbreviations in that particular section. So there's some other things that are going to go in. One is the area of potential effect. And the area of potential, it still mirrors your 106 process. You laid out your area of potential effect for your undertaking, and now you're just going to make sure and note it in here. Now in this orange box, it's mentioned the actual street boundaries that are the area of potential effect. You could also say, whereas the federal agency has determined that the area of potential effect is as noted in Appendix A. If that works better, if it's an irregular boundary or it's multiple sites, things like that. Once you've got your area of potential effect, you want to make sure that you've identified any historic properties that are within that APE, just the same way you do when you're doing your 106 process. And that can be something as simple as saying the property is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. That's sufficient to say, and this is property as in capital P. We've already somewhere else defined what the property is. We've said the address, we've said the name of it, we've identified it somehow. Now in the case of this green box down here, we've gone into much greater detail because it's a different kind of condition. Okay, the undertaking is going to have an effect on the U.S. Custom House. That's easy. That's listed on the National Register, as well as the International Building. The International Building is a privately owned property located adjacent to the project site, gives the address, when it was constructed, it was determined eligible by GSA in consultation with the SHPO. So it says where, that there's a historic property here, and that, we've made this determination, this is how we know it's a historic property. And then we've even gone one step further and said GSA informed the owner of the International Building regarding the determination of eligibility. Because we're going to say in one of our subsequent paragraphs that we've asked them to participate and they declined. So you do whatever you need to do that explains your project. Once you've got your ID done, then you always make a statement about effects, and in general, it's going to be an adverse effect. There's going to be a paragraph in there that says, whereas our project is having our undertaking is having an adverse effect to a historic property. This one talks about applying the criteria of adverse effect. Occasionally, you'll say you don't know what effect you're having, but by and large, it's an adverse effect, or you wouldn't have gone into consultation and you wouldn't be preparing an MOA. So that's a pretty standard part of it. And then you also want to record the consultation. You're going to specifically mention that you consulted with the SHPO, the Advisory Council. In this particular case, it's, they consulted with a bunch of Indian tribes to determine if they had any significance. You might say something like, somebody was notified and requested if they wanted to participate in consultation and that they declined or that they didn't respond. But you record what exactly you did in consultation with the consulting parties. So just to kind of recap it again, make sure that your roles and responsibilities of the participants are identified. I mean, it's important to identify the responsible federal agency and identify the lead federal agency, because in a lot of MOAs, there's multiple federal agencies. So it's not always obvious which one is the lead federal agency. And if stuff is delegated to somebody else, identify the roles of the consulting parties, what you intend for them to do, so that everybody's in agreement and they're signing off. So, as a checklist, when you're done with your preamble, these two questions should be answered adequately. Is the entire undertaking and the nature of the federal involvement described, and have the historic properties affected by the undertaking been identified? So that all happens in the preamble. That's why it can be multiple pages long if you've got a lot of stuff that you need to define. And then at the very end of it, the only paragraph or sentence that is going to start with anything other than whereas is the now therefore. So again, whereas, now therefore. The federal agency, the SHPO, the advisory council agree that the following stipulations be implemented, and then it says, these are the two standard requirements of 106. In order to take into account the undertaking's effect on historic properties, and that they'll govern the undertaking. But this is a standard paragraph, so these could be used from one document to the other. So that ends your preamble. And then you get into section 3, stipulations. And these are the provisions that were agreed to in consultation. And this section will always start with a GSA shall ensure that the following stipulations are carried out. Okay, so it's always the federal agency that's ensuring that the stipulations are carried out. Now, there are some exceptions to that, because I know you're saying, well, I've delegated my authority to somebody else. But fundamentally, the federal agency is responsible for 106 compliance and can't just delegate it away. So if all of your stipulations require somebody else to take an action, it would say something like, the federal agency shall ensure that the nonprofit group will carry out the following stipulations. But the federal agency is still on the hook to do that. So the stipulations are action items. Where the preamble defined the givens of the undertaking, the stipulations section is the to-do list of agreements made during consultation. So that's going to have all of the actions or tasks. It's going to have who it's assigned to. It's going to have a time frame for them to do those actions or tasks. And if necessary, it's going to talk about who's paying for the tasks. So in the case of the blue box here, it says, at its sole cost and expense, the city will prepare an HSR for the National Historic Landmark. And the HSR is going to be subject to the approval of SHPO. So right there, it very clearly states that the city is doing the preparation, they're paying for it. There's probably another paragraph that talks about timing in there, but you go through your thing and describe how this HSR is going to get prepared and reviewed and who's going to use it. In the orangish paragraph down here, it talks about project document submission, which is another way to do it. It says the federal agency will prepare and submit to SHPO for review the documents listed below, which these will be referred to as project documents. So then the federal agency submits it to SHPO, and SHPO has 30 calendar days to review each of the submittals. In In the stipulation section, as in most of the MOA, you want to make sure and avoid a passive voice. You want to make sure that you've got somebody assigned to a certain task. So you would say the federal agency shall prepare an HSR, rather than saying something like an HSR will be prepared. You don't want to leave anything open that said, well, prepared by whom? I thought you were doing it. No, I thought you were doing it. So make sure and avoid the passive voice when you're doing your MOA. So again, just to recap, stipulations are the process for the decision making described in a complete, logically organized way. Who makes the decisions? Who's consulted? When do these decisions need to be made? What information is needed? Make sure and kind of just go back through your mind and see if these questions are answered. You know, that it's clear that the federal agency will submit something, the SHPO will respond in X number of days. What happens if an entity doesn't respond in that amount of time? Make sure those things are all thought out. So many undertakings have an archaeological component as well. If a data recovery plan or an archaeological plan is already prepared, that can be included as an appendix to your MOA, just the way that orange paragraph there is. It's BIA shall implement the treatment plan in Appendix A. But if not, if you need to prepare a data recovery plan, then you follow the same guidelines as for the other tasks. Who's responsible for preparing the plan? When does it need to be prepared? Who pays for it? And then in addition to your other specific research questions, you make sure that the work is done to the Secretary's standards and carried out by qualified professionals. And this paragraph, the blue paragraph, is a standard part of most MOAs. You want to make sure and work into your agreement document that all work that's done is done in accordance with the Secretary's standards. That just covers you so that if anybody says, well, I didn't, I thought this was good enough. No, you want to make sure that you're very clear with it. And the same applies with the professional qualification standards. You always want to have this stipulation in your MOA somewhere to make sure that any of the consultants that are hired or anybody that's doing work pursuant to your MOA is qualified, that they have experience with historic buildings and historic preservation work. So in addition to your undertaking specific stipulations, there's several administrative stipulations that should be included as well. Monitoring and reporting is necessary in almost all MOAs so that the parties that signed the MOA are assured that the work is getting done the way that they agreed to it. So in this green box, for instance, the federal agency is hiring an independent consultant who meets the professional requirements clause, who's going to monitor the construction work to make sure that it conforms with the approved project documents. So we've agreed on a set of documents that the work is going to be done this way. Federal agency goes off and starts the construction, and there's an independent oversight that says, yes, it's being done according to the documents. So that's one. Other administrative provisions are for discoveries. It's always good to put in a discoveries stipulation. These are mostly for archaeological discoveries, but occasionally an above-ground historic property is discovered during an undertaking. But it just helps to have it in there so that the entity doing the construction knows how long they should have to stop their work if they find something, and how long the SHPO should have to respond, to make a comment on it. So those are good, and they're pretty standard wording. You just want to make sure that you get them in there. The other thing is with emergencies, emergencies can always happen. The property can be damaged by fire, flood, earthquake. It can be damaged during construction. So it's very important that the signatories are aware of procedures, the procedures that they're expected to follow to avoid unnecessary demolition. What you don't want to happen is, oh, you're going along, restoring a historic property, a flood comes along, it looks really bad. Well, now it'd be cheaper for us to just demolish and rebuild it. That's always a risk for historic property, so you want to make sure that you've got it covered. But here's the one section where you can use some looser wording. And if you notice in the two red statements, the word reasonable is in there. You know, you want to say a reasonably safe condition or commercially reasonable efforts. Those are good enough wording to use in the event of an emergency. It's just to keep the property, you know, in a safe condition until the consulting parties can talk about it briefly. So there's some other administrative provisions that must be included. One is the duration of the agreement. And you always want to put something in there that says how long your agreement is in effect for. You don't want an agreement that goes on for 10, 20, or 30 years, and it's just not very, it's better to have an end date. But you also don't want to end it too soon to where you have to keep renegotiating or re-signing the agreement. So if you know your construction project is going to take 3 years, then make your agreement document last for at least 5 to 10 years, just to cover any kind of delays or things that might happen. If it's getting outside the 10 to 15-year range, then you probably ought to be renegotiating at that point anyway, because that's kind of a long time frame, and things can change a lot. So that one is going to be unique to your particular undertaking in your MOA, the duration. It can also start at a given time. You can say this MOA will take effect once a property is transferred or once this is approved or something like that. So this, keep in mind the start and the end date of the MOA are things that you can decide when they go into effect. Now, amendments and dispute resolution are pretty standard processes that you can have laid out and you can use throughout any of your agreement documents. Everybody, you know, misses something at some point, so you want to make sure and include a provision for amendments to the document and dispute resolution. You never know when you're going to get to an impasse with one of the issues or not, so you want to make sure that you've just got something laid out that says, okay, if we just get to this stalemate, this is the process that we're going to take, and we're going to, you know, agree to abide by it. And then the other required administrative stipulation is on termination. So there's two different kinds of termination. One is terminating consultation, and then one is termination of the MOA. Terminating consultation is a big decision. It's made by your senior policy officials, and it's not something that anybody takes lightly. So you will get attention if you try to terminate consultation. If the federal agency terminates consultation, which happens, you know, if they decide that they really just can't go ahead with their undertaking, you know, for whatever reason, they still are obligated to get comments from the advisory council. But at that, you know, after they've done that, then they are, you know, can go ahead with their undertaking. In some cases, the SHPO is going to terminate the consultation portion. If that's the case, the agency and the advisory council can still execute the MOA. If a THPO terminates, then the advisory council is required to comment. But if the SHPO terminates, you can still go ahead with a federal agency and the advisory council. Now, in terms of the termination of the MOA, that's a little bit simpler than terminating all of consultation, but you should consult, you should go through the dispute resolution portion before you even consider termination. So those are the main provisions in the stipulation section. So just as a checklist, I also usually have a definitions stipulation, and that can be, up to 20, 30 definitions that appear throughout my MOA. But make sure that you've got your terms and your references used accurately. As I mentioned before, words like project, undertaking, those are important to be very consistent throughout. Don't use the familiar name of your project. Don't say, okay, 123 Main Street, or whatever you usually call it. And then make sure you've avoided using the passive voice, because then you might have actions that don't have anybody assigned to them, and that you've included time frames for anything that you needs a time frame on. That's very important. So once you're done with the stipulation section, the fourth section is the execution clause, and this is the final section of the MOA. This sentence is standard, just like the now, therefore, and the federal agency shall ensure. This one always appears at the top of the signature page. Execution of the MOA evidences that you have done the two things that you're required to do under Section 106, which is take into account what effect your undertaking is having on historic properties and allow the advisory council a chance to comment. This wording can vary. You can, you can make whatever wording that you like best, but then you can use it from one MOA to the other. It doesn't have to be particularly unique to your MOA. Then immediately after that execution statement are the signature lines. And just to go over again, we had the signatories. That was either the two-party or the three-party signatures, the federal agency, the SHPO, and the advisory council. The invited signatories, whoever those were, that's the ones that had the role in the MOA. And the concurring parties, the ones that have been in your consultation and are concurring in your MOA. And then if you look at the bottom, you can see who gets to amend and terminate the agreement document and who executes the agreement document. So that's the body of the MOA itself. Now you also could have any appendices that might be necessary. A lot of times a set of drawings might be included in it as an appendix. You can say, okay, this MOA is based on the 100% construction drawings dated blah, blah, blah. It could be maps, such as the map of the APE. It could be photographs of a particular condition of a site. It could be HSRs, National Register forms, whatever is necessary to get the parties in an agreement on your undertaking. Can be included in the appendix, or nothing. If you don't feel like it needs any more, then you don't have to put any appendixes in. So that was an MOA, and that is the core document that you would use for recording an agreement on a specific undertaking. But there's also programmatic agreements. Those are the two main agreement documents that we do. And programmatic agreements are more like, as they say, they're appropriate for programs. If a federal agency has a program to permit cutting in the national forest or whatever, I mean, you can do a programmatic agreement for whatever your program is. It works to delegate authority, because you've got another entity in there signing that they agree to do certain things. It could be used for multiple or complex undertakings, and that's going to be more like our case study that Julie's going to talk about. It might be used if you don't know what effect your undertaking is going to have because you haven't gotten that far down the road. Or it could be used for routine management or maintenance of your properties. The format is very similar to the MOAs. It's got the title, the preamble, the stipulations, and the signatures. In the orange box is the programmatic agreement that I use here at GSA Region 9. And if you look, it says, among Region 9 of the General Services Administration and the State Historic Preservation Officers of 4 different states, Arizona, California, Hawaii, and Nevada, and the Advisory Council regarding, and then it's like the preservation, maintenance, rehabilitation, and use of historic properties. So it's a big agreement document that covers hundreds of routine undertakings that GSA Region 9 does during the course of a year. And then the way we've all agreed up front what effect that these undertakings are having, and we've said that we're going to report to the Advisory Council and the 4 state SHPOs each year what we've reviewed under this programmatic agreement. So that would have been an example of a programmatic agreement. There are also project programmatic agreements. And they're more similar to memorandums of agreement. Generally, and to determine whether or not you've got a programmatic agreement, a project programmatic agreement, or a memorandum of agreement, just talk about it with the SHPO or the Advisory Council because they'll have an opinion. Usually, if a project has a definite start and an end time, it's an MOA. If it doesn't, it's closer to a PA. But there's some areas, gray areas in there too. If it's a discrete project that you can easily define, it might be an MOA. If it's a complex project, like I said, like Julie's going to talk about, it's a programmatic agreement. So this is just an example of a project that's not. It wasn't a big project. It's the old U.S. Mint in San Francisco, but they didn't know what was going to be the outcome of the building. They didn't know what it was going to be used for. So that's how come that was decided to be a programmatic agreement. So the biggest help for, if you don't know where to start and you've got to do an agreement document, is with the Advisory Council. Now, remember, in your consultation, they must be notified of an adverse effect. So you've already been in sort of consultation with them, but you can also just call them or go on their website, and there's a lot of information there that they can help. They've got some guidance preparing agreement documents. They're updating that, so that should be available shortly. They've got a model MOA that you can get a template for, and then the white is the standard wording, and then wherever it's red, you just insert your information into that. They've got on their website a list of agreement documents that have been filed with them that you can feel free to read more about. Or, the other way to get started with your MOA is to borrow agreement documents from other coworkers or federal agencies. Like I said, this doesn't have to be a creative writing assignment where you have to worry about plagiarism, because what you want is, once you put your undertaking in it, it becomes your own document. So you can, as far as getting the format, you can get the format anywhere that you can get a sample. So just to wrap it up, the MOA, once you've reached agreement among the consulting parties, you're going to document it in an MOA, and then you always have to file your MOA with the Advisory Council. Even if they're not a signatory on the MOA, that's the last thing you do after you've got it signed by all your other parties. You send them a signed copy so that they file it. And then you need to implement the undertaking according to the terms. Once it gets filed, it doesn't mean that it goes into a cabinet and people forget about it forever. The actions on it need to be completed. So give some thought to getting copies of the MOA to all the parties that need to make sure that they need to do work on it. And then again, just a reminder that if you didn't get to an agreement document, you still need to take into account the council comments before your agency head makes the final decision to go ahead with the undertaking. And there are also inform the public requirements throughout Section 106. So keep that kind of in mind. But if you've been involving local historical associations or other individuals, you've probably been fulfilling that end of it. These next 5 pages, I've just included an MOA that I worked on in its entirety so that you can see how where all the parts are in one whole entire MOA. You can see the whereas clauses. Now we've got the stipulations. It looks like, oh, the pages are out of order here. Sorry about that. Stipulations are, and then and those will all, you've got to do your numbering convention. You either start with Roman numerals and then letters, or format it. I guess they all got in there backwards. I'm sorry about that. But and then at the end, it's the execution clause, and then the signatories and the attachments. I didn't include the attachments. And now I would like to turn it over to Julie, who will take us through a case study of the project that she's working on. Thank you.
Thanks, Jane. Can everyone hear me okay?
You're good, Julie, you're good.
Okay, good. It just suddenly went completely blank. Hi, everybody. So I'm Julie Polanco, and I'm going to give you a case study about the prototype programmatic agreements. So this was a partnership between, a public-private partnership between the Army and Lend-Lease. Lend-Lease is a privatized military developer in the United States, and Intercontinental Hotel Group is the hotel partner. And the goal of the project was to improve the quality of lodging for soldiers and their families. So on installations, military installations around the country, there are hotels that are utilized by soldiers and or military folks, their families, and retired military. This project was implemented in its initial phase 3 years ago. And on the Army bases in particular that we're working, it's to rehabilitate existing lodging, to build new hotels, and the duration of the projects is a 50-year lease. So there's a ground lease for each of the individual installations. These are the sites in PALS in groups A and B that have already been let, and so we're currently working on those sites. So groups A and B have already been transferred, and Group C is in progress. So what that means is there are a list of installations in Group C that have been identified, and buildings have been suggested, and now due diligence happens where the Army and Lend-Lease go through and look at all of the lodging and look at the funds available, and then they do a little bit of horse trading, if you will, and at some point a list of which buildings in Group C will be finalized. Possible actions under the National Historic Preservation Act include the rehabilitation of historic buildings and their settings, contextual design for new buildings adjacent to or in historic districts, and archaeological resources. All of these things have been identified prior to the transfer of the property. So register nominations, archaeological phase 1s, and sometimes phase 2s have been completed. This is an example of Fort Sam Houston. It was in PAL Group A, and this was the site location map that was from the programmatic agreement there for the area of potential effect. So parcels A, 1, 2, and 3 are a new build site adjacent to 2 historic districts. If you look at the map on both to the right and the left, all of those buildings that surround that central, it's a parking structure or parking area now, is a new build site adjacent to historic districts. Parcels C, B, and G are existing buildings that are not historic, and parcels D and E are historic buildings in historic districts. They both are. So this is the Fort Sam Houston House. It is in a National Historic District called the Quad and Staff Post Area, which was added to the National Register in 1975. It's a two-story rusticated limestone building in the high Italianate style. It's been modified over time with additions to the rear, and it sits in the middle of a housing area and was the former bachelor officers' quarters for the Quad and Staff Post area of Fort Sam Houston. The next one we have is the Floyd House. This also was a bachelor officers' quarters from 1908, and it too sits in the midst of a residential area with the commercial buildings across the street from the buildings across the parking lot. So we have PAL A and B. There are 10 installations that have historic buildings in those two groups. And one of the lessons learned, what brought us to this prototype programmatic agreement, was that each installation had its own programmatic agreement. And one entity, Lend-Lease, is managing 10 different programmatic agreements. So the challenge in that is how do you then manage over a 50-year period historic buildings that have similar and different requirements? What happened was we suggested with our Army partner to create a prototype programmatic agreement, so a framework for PAL-C that can be modified for each installation's individual situation and need, but provide a certainty and a level of consistency among the sites for management. The Advisory Council convened a working group in January that consisted of their staff, some staff from the PAL-B group of cultural resource managers who had gone through painstaking processes for individual programmatic agreements the year before, representatives of the Army Corps of Engineers who work on behalf of the Army and the Pentagon, Lend-Lease, the National Conference of State Historic Preservation Offices, Nick Shippo, participated, the National Association of Tribal Preservation Officers participated, and the National Trust. The National Park Service was invited to participate, as some of the potential PAL-C sites have National Historic Landmarks, but they declined to participate. This slide shows, again, a PAL-B project. This is Fort Leavenworth. This is the map, the APE map that came from that individual programmatic agreement, and the building on the top is Custer House. Both of these buildings are from the late 1800s. The one below is Otis, and Custer was always distinguished visitors' quarters. It sits among residential units. Otis was former bachelor officers' quarters that was changed to lodging. It sits at the edge of the district. It's pretty typical of the military vocabulary to have these building types scattered among the housing units, and then at some point in the middle of this century, they were changed into lodging. So the process was to create a draft framework for the elements of Group A and B in place. So we took cues from those two programmatic agreement groupings and sort of took the best of the best, if you will, and put them into one prototype framework. From there, the Advisory Council held several meetings to discuss, edit, review, and discuss, and this went on for about 3 or 4 drafts until a final draft was acceptable to all interested parties. At that point, individual SHPOs and TIPOs with potential sites in PAL-C were invited to participate, and they did. I think we had participation from maybe 10 SHPOs and 5 TIPOs who reviewed the final draft and provided comments to the Advisory Council that were addressed and or accepted depending on the comment. And then the final draft was approved by the chairman of the council, Wayne Donaldson, and is now ready for use. When the PAL-C sites have been determined, the individual buildings within each of the sites have been determined and agreed upon between Lend-Lease and the Army. Those installations with historic resources will be able to modify the prototype for their unique circumstances. The process will remain the same. Each SHPO then will be consulted as per usual with the understanding that the prototype was already agreed upon. The framework itself. Federally recognized tribes as appropriate will be invited to participate. We have in PAL A and B at the 10 installations we currently have several sites that have federally recognized tribes and Native Hawaiian organizations. And then the concurring parties will be invited to participate to include Lend-Lease. Though Lend-Lease is the managing partner for these properties for 50 years, it is a concurring party. The military, the Army retains the federal designation. The next steps also include public notice that will take place as per usual, and installations will be required to undertake NEPA and other requirements as per usual. So there's a lot of work that goes into these projects and their transition in addition to the programmatic agreements. These two buildings are at Fort Riley. They both exist in a national registered district. The one on the left was the former Frontier Post store that was modified into a bachelor officer's quarters, and then in the 20s, and then a lodge sometime in the 50s. And the one on the right has always been a distinguished visitor's quarters. It's quite a sweet little house that's located in between a bunch of residential units, and it's a suite-like situation on its interior, and it's always been a single standalone building made out of that beautiful buttercream limestone that Fort Riley has. So the benefits of this prototype programmatic agreement are that preservation partners have already agreed to the major points. Management's consistent in all of them, so it decreases the time for cultural resource managers, SHPOs, and other concurring parties to review and sign the documents once they're finalized. For the resource, it provides a consistent framework for managing these resources over a 50-year period for Lend-Lease. We have a cultural resource staff of 2 to manage 22 programmatic agreements currently. The potential for PAL-C will be about 10 more installations. And so these projects then now have the ability to have a more consistent framework for management and a known and certain process, which helps greatly in ensuring that these resources are protected. The look ahead for the prototype itself is that the framework can be used for other similar programs that have multiple sites and varying resources. So if a federal agency has a similar type of situation, the prototype PA can be modified for their situation and then further modified for the individual situation. So it's a really useful tool that once the advisory council undertook it as a prototype can be modified for other situations. Resource protection is assured in a known and certain process. So when projects have programmatic agreements, the lenders and everybody that has a stake in the claim, if you will, has the ability to review these, and it gives everybody a certain and known process that the projects will be successful. Lenders are happy that they'll get paid back. The military partners pleased that the soldiers and their families will have an increased level of experience when they stay in hotels. And the duties and responsible parties are defined for the duration of the ground lease in these PAs. So in the end, it's a win-win for both the resources and the partners and the public. These are public buildings. They are managed for a 50-year period, and they revert back to the military partner. So they're in stewardship to us for that period, at which time they go back into the government ownership unless another agreement is determined. And I just end that on with a slide of all of the installations that are in this project, and you can see the number of them and why this prototype PA was very useful. 10 and 11, so 21 for PALs A and B. Out of those, half, 10, were had historic resources, and in PAL-C we're looking at potentially 10 and maybe more. There's been further conversation about whether those installations in A and B will be interested in modifying their PAs to match the ones in PAL-C, but we're going to get through PAL-C first before we undertake that big modification. And with that, that's the prototype PA. I have to say that it was an effort by many, and it had lots of input. It was done over a very brief period, perhaps 4 months total, with a lot of managing by Chris Wilson at the Advisory Council, who is the Army liaison, but with a lot of input by the National Trust and public partners to understand both the projects, why the prototype was necessary, and to make it successful and workable and accountable. The accountability portion was very important to partners as well. So in the end, it was a really big effort that will provide very useful for us, the developer partner, in management, but also ultimately to protection of resources, which is the purpose of these things altogether. So that's the prototype, and with that I'll return it to Jennifer.
All right, thank you, Julie. And right now we'll accept any questions. So again, you can ask questions using that function on your toolbar. So if you've hidden your toolbar, you can open it up and then go ahead and type them, and you can send them to me and I will ask the questions. You can say if you would like it for Jane or Julie. Otherwise I'll ask it to the group. And I'll go ahead and ask a question of my own. Julie, can you give a couple of examples of some of the, maybe the stipulations or something along those lines that are, what's consistent amongst these documents, the PAs?
Yes. So all of them have a lot of the sections that Jane had mentioned. The whereas clauses define the program itself, why the buildings are being transferred, and what the rules for the transfer are. They all require conditions assessments to be done at the time of transfer by the developer partner. They all have, depending on the level of action, activities that can be done with just on routine maintenance appendices, for example. So changing of light fixtures or toilets or things that are not character defining or historic can be done without a prior approval. There are levels of sort of middle consultation that have to happen with the installation cultural resource manager, and then major undertakings, for example, at Fort Sam Houston, that new build site had to be reviewed by both the cultural resource manager at the installation and the SHPO for compatibility with the historic district. So it gives us sort of small, medium, and large for consultations and when they need to be seen. All of those activities are captured in an annual report that goes to the signatory and concurring parties for each of the agreements. So those are pretty consistent items. The developer partner is required to train their staff. They're also required to maintain a person who is qualified under the Secretary of the Interior standards to manage the programmatic agreements on behalf of the projects. And for the programmatic agreements, we have I serve that role. And so standard items, but I think the most unique are the training. The way that the actions under the agreement are divided by level and who needs to review them are very critical for everybody. The amount of work on these projects is extremely high. And for SHPO to see everything was something that seemed a bit excessive. So those types of things were agreed to were sort of the major conversations. The tribes really didn't have much contribution other than they were happy to know about them. And they're mostly interested in any repatriation that has to do with ground disturbing activities, which really have to do with the new build, and most of the sites have already been cleared.
Okay, are there any questions out there? Jane or Julie, do you have any any other comments or last-minute comments or anything that you wanted to say?
No, I don't have any. Thanks everybody for listening, and if you need assistance with memorandums of agreement, just keep asking around, because there's a lot of them out there, and they're not as daunting as they might first appear, and they can actually be fun once you get the hang of it.
Right. And this is Julie. The one thing I would say is that you'll notice that Lend-Lease is not, so the developer partner is not a signatory party to the programmatic agreements. The federal agency, the Army, retains that lead agency status. But because it's attached to our ground lease, it's still a binding responsibility on the developer partner. And in these privatized projects, there are many developers. It's not Lend-Lease is just one in the housing section. We're the only ones that have lodging. But there was a whole big conversation at the beginning about why we weren't signatory parties, and did that mean we were going to be responsible, and what happens if the developer goes in a different direction. And so I just would say not to get hung up about whether or not there's a concurring or the signatory party, as long as there's another way to hold everybody responsible for actions. And sometimes ground leases are more important in that sense. And so at the end, it might be a different framework, but as long as everyone's known and the responsibility is determined, and the resource protection is solid, that's the name of the game, is protecting these resources. And as Jane said, I think programmatic agreements are really fun, and I think they can be really successful. And the key to them are relationships with your partners. And as long as you can maintain that, they are the easiest thing and the biggest gift the advisory council can give you. So keep in mind that they are gifts from the council, and the council always likes to remind us that they can take them at any time. So you're keeping up with them and maintaining them and keeping everybody informed is always really important.
All right, we do have a question that came up. And the question is, for either one of you, what is the difference between an MOA and an MOU?
Well, this is Jane, and MOAs to me are the official terminology that you would use in Section 106. Section 106 doesn't, that I'm aware of, use MOUs. I think those are other legislation might have MOUs. I don't know, Julie, do you know anything official about MOUs?
I can tell you that in the federal framework that my experience is an MOU is not used. It was used when I worked in the state framework. So when I worked at the state of California, MOUs were used instead of MOAs. So the difference might be CEQA versus NEPA or NHPA.
Yeah, that might be, because I know in terms of Section 106 regulation, there is no MOU in there. So you always have a MOA because you've got agreement. I mean, so
right.
That's what we use.
Right, and Section 106 says agreement document, so it's MOA or PA. So my experience is the MOUs are used in state frameworks or local government frameworks.
Are there any other questions? Okay. If you do have a question later today, feel free to email me, and I'll email the ladies and get an answer back to you. So thank you again for joining us today. And later today, you'll receive an email with a link to a survey. We would appreciate any feedback on this webinar and recommendations for future topics. I will also send an email today with a link to today's presentation. Our next module in this webinar series will be July 24th on community involvement in the Section 106 process by Brian Turner from the National Trust. We hope you have a good rest of the afternoon, and thank you very much. Thank you, ladies.
Bye. Thank you, Jennifer.